This presentation is a study aid prepared by Professor David Spener of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology of Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, for students in his Race in America course, Spring 2020 semester. In 2005, the Mexican Census Bureau, known as INEGI by its Spanish language initials, estimated the country's population to be 112 million persons. Of these 112 million persons, 13% identified themselves as white, nearly 2/3 as mestizo, 12% as indigenous, and 3% as black, and 8% as other, which includes not an insignificant population of Chinese and other East Asian immigrants and their descendants. Remember that Mexico was the destination of tens of thousands of African slaves who were dispersed to various regions of the country and eventually absorbed into the majority mestizo population. The Afro-descendant population in Mexico today is heavily concentrated in small towns on the coasts of Guerrero and Oaxaca on the Pacific and in Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. The official estimate of the indigenous population in Mexico was 12% in 2005. But the estimates of the absolute and relative sizes of the indigenous population in Mexico depends strongly on how indigeneity is defined and what specific questions people are asked about their race, their cultural identity, and their language practices. As discussed in Pigmentocracies, the Mexican state has worked hard for over a century to emphasize that Mexicans are a mestizo people proud of their ancient indigenous roots, but proudly modern in their blended Euro-indigenous identities. There is a tremendous diversity of indigenous languages spoken in Mexico today, but only a few major languages dominate. Of the 6 million Mexicans aged 5 or older who spoke an indigenous language, over half spoke Nahuatl, Maya, Mixteco, Zapoteco, Tzeltal, or Tzotzil. According to INEGI, 90 years ago, the Mexican population had about 14 million people aged 5 and older, and 16% of those 14 million people spoke an indigenous language. By the end of the 20th century, the Mexican population 5 years of age and older had grown to around 85 million people, only 7% of whom spoke an indigenous language. At the same time, the absolute number of speakers of indigenous languages grew in absolute terms from 2.3 million in 1930 to over 6 million at the end of the century. It is also important to recognize that indigenous languages are much more widely spoken in certain parts of Mexico than in others. In the state of Oaxaca, for example, more than 30% of inhabitants speak an indigenous language, especially Zapoteco or Mixteco, while in Chiapas, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo states, between 15 and 30% of inhabitants speak an indigenous language, mainly one of the Maya dialects. As you can see on the map, indigenous speakers are strongly concentrated in southern Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. It is not accidental that southern Mexico is thought of as Indian Mexico, while the northern states are thought of as being inhabited by a white and mestizo population. Mexico's linguistic variation owes not only to the speaking of many different indigenous languages. The dialect of Spanish spoken also varies considerably from one part of the country to another. These Spanish dialects are, of course, mutually intelligible and vary primarily in terms of certain relatively minor phonetic and semantic features. Figure 2.2 on page 51 of Pigmentocracies shows the wide variation in the estimates of the relative size of the indigenous population in Mexico, depending on the criteria used. As the authors explain, people are more likely to identify with specific indigenous groups, such as Maya, Zapotec, Nahua, etc., than they are with the generic label indigenous. Especially striking in this graph is how the percent of respondents identifying as indigenous jumps to over 40% when they are asked if they have an indigenous ancestor that they know of. Here it is also important to note that the indigenous population of Mexico grew from just 6.2% of the Mexican population as measured in the 2000 census to nearly 15% as measured by the census of 2010. Such growth owed not to immigration or live births, but rather to more Mexicans deciding to identify themselves as indigenous. This graph shows the range of interviewer-ascribed skin colors using the Perla palette for each self-ascribed racial category, white, mestizo, and indigenous. What is perhaps most interesting in this graph is how there is considerable overlap between self-identified whites and mestizos in terms of their skin tone, and especially between mestizos and indigenous in terms of their skin tone. Thus, we see that the mode for skin tone for whites was 3 on the Perla skin tone palette, while for mestizo the mode was only slightly different at 4 on the Perla palette. Similarly, 25% of those categorizing themselves as indigenous were marked as a 4 on the Perla palette by interviewers, only 5 percentage points lower than was the case for mestizos, and only 5 percentage points higher than for whites. One of the things that the authors of Chapter 2 of Pigmentocracy emphasize is the effectiveness of the Mexican state's promotion of mestizo identity and ideology, especially through schooling. The impact of the state's promotion of mestizaje as essential to national identity could not be seen more clearly than in this graph, which demonstrates how, net of other factors, people with more years of schooling completed are more likely to identify themselves as mestiza or mestizo. Thus, unlike in Brazil or in the United States, where being categorized as white is strongly associated with having higher levels of formal schooling completed than people categorized as black or brown, in Mexico, it is the intermediate race category of mestizo that is most predictive of higher levels of formal education completed. Although the authors of this chapter on Mexico do not make the point as explicitly as the authors of the chapter on Brazil did, the results shown in this figure also suggest that there is something of an endogeneity problem with respect to mestizo ethno-racial identity in Mexico. In other words, it's not clear that being mestizo is an advantage in obtaining higher levels of education, or that having higher levels of education makes a person more likely to identify as mestizo than if their educational level were lower. Figure 2.7 from Pigmentocracies illustrates how the white identity is most strongly rooted in the northern Mexican states, which are seen as having a strong relationship with the United States and small indigenous populations. The northern states of Mexico that border the United States are also generally the most prosperous states in Mexico in terms of annual income, and are also regarded as the most entrepreneurial and industrially advanced, all things that are associated with whiteness. The figure shows that people with the same skin color are more likely to self-identify as white if they live in northern Mexico than if they live in any other region of the country. Think about how the pattern in this figure relates to the map we looked at earlier that shows the percent of the population that speaks an indigenous language in different Mexican states. Figure 2.8 of Pigmentocracies shows the likelihood of a person identifying as indigenous, depending on type of place of residence, net of other factors including age, gender, skin color, and geographic region in Mexico. The pattern shown here shows that people of the same age, gender, and skin color are considerably more likely to identify as indigenous if they live in a rural area than if they live in a city, and that the likelihood of identifying as indigenous falls as the size of the city grows. This suggests that urban residents, and especially residents in a major metropolitan area, tends to encourage, in quotes, indigenous people to start thinking of themselves as mestizos. Think about how the pattern shown in these data compares to Guillermo Bonfil Batalla's claim as an anthropologist that Mexico City is the largest Indian city in the world. People of different indigenous groups have differing levels of identifying with the generic or pan-ethnic indigenous label. Here we see the variation in who identifies as indigenous depending upon indigenous language spoken. Maya is an exceptional case here, as explained by the authors of this chapter of Pigmentocracies, probably owing to the War of the Castes in the Yucatan Peninsula in the 19th century, in which indigenous organizations were brutally repressed. According to the authors, this likely resulted in the retreat of local Mayans from the stigmatized indigenous category and in their adoption of the more neutral mestizo category, even as they continued to speak a Maya dialect and to think of themselves as Maya. Table 2.3 reports the experiences that informants have had with regard to discrimination based on their accent, their economic situation, or their skin color. Here the results are quite similar to what was observed in Brazil, namely that people with dark skin were substantially more likely to experience these forms of discrimination than lighter-skinned people. This table also shows that people who identify as indigenous were also strikingly more likely to report these forms of discrimination than either whites or mestizos. It is interesting to consider the results displayed in Figure 2.11 in light of the results shown in Table 2.3 that indicate a large proportion of indigenous people report being discriminated against. Figure 2.11 indicates that a strong majority of Mexicans believe that indigenous people are poor in some measure because they are treated unfairly and have little formal schooling. Relatively few Mexicans believe that indigenous poverty owes to lower intelligence or poor work ethic. These results are consistent with official state ideology since the time of the Mexican Revolution, but live alongside high levels of discrimination against the indigenous people who live in Mexico today. Figure 2.13 also provides an interesting contrast with the official ideology of mestizaje, cultural and racial fusion, in Mexico. A strong majority of members of all ethno-racial groups interviewed by Perla researchers, indigenous, mestizo, white, and other, reported that their significant other was of the same group as they were. In other words, endogamous relationships were the norm, in spite of official celebration of cultural and racial mixing as an essential element of Mexican national identity. Figure 2.15 contrasts the mean years of education completed by ethno-racial category membership with mean years of education according to skin color. As we saw in one of the previous figures, mestizo identity is associated with higher levels of education on average than is belonging to the indigenous or white group. Nevertheless, on the right-hand side of the figure, we see that there is a linear relationship between skin color and mean years of schooling completed, such that lighter-skinned people on average complete more formal schooling than people with medium skin tones, who in turn complete more years of education on average than dark-skinned persons. Here again we see how ethno-racial categories are socially constructed in powerful ways, and how the mestizo category is not seen as a plural or mixed racial category, but rather as an internally uniform category distinct from both white and indigenous. Not surprisingly, given the results shown in Figure 2.15, Figure 2.16 shows the colorism that operates within each ethno-racial category with respect to mean years of schooling completed. In other words, lighter skin is rewarded and darker skin is penalized within all three groups, indigenous, mestizo, and white. Finally, Figure 2.17 indicates the same patterns as the previous two figures, except that here we see differences in the percent of people in each group that holds a high-status non-manual job. Here again we see the value of mestizo identity independent of skin color, as mestizos are more likely to be high-status professionals than either whites or indigenous. But the results also confirm that skin color plays a role in predicting occupational prestige. And here's where we'll end our brief presentation.